Hi everybody, welcome to our first presentation. This is designed to give you an overview of the brain, how it works a little bit, parts that are involved, just to give you a little bit of background information and also a sense of how we know what we know about it. To start this off, I think it's really important to think in terms of this quote. David Sousa is an author, he's a doctor of education, and he has written a series of books, one of which is How the Brain Learns, but also a whole series, How the Brain Learns Mathematics and How the Brain Learns to Read, and so on. And he makes a really important point that teachers are the only people in the world whose job it is to change the human brain every day. And if you think about it, that is exactly what we do with our students every single day. We are there to try to change their thinking, to improve their thought processes, to give them information, and to help them grow and develop. And in doing so, we literally change the way their brains work every single day. So it behooves us as teachers to understand exactly how the brain works so that we can maximize our approach to, gear our approach to make sure that we are really appealing to students the way that they learn best. So this is a nice drawing of the human brain. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see what it looks like from back to front. The human brain, adult brain, weighs about 3 pounds. It actually weighs just a little bit less than 3 pounds. And from back to front, it's about 15 centimeters long. It's not a very impressive looking organ, quite frankly. It's kind of a strange looking organ. And it's even stranger in terms of the texture of it. It's a soft, squishy, and incredibly fragile texture. People have to be incredibly careful when they handle it because just slight pressure on it can actually damage it, which is truly strange if you think about, the fact that the skull is not a terribly thick protective coating, and yet that's all that there is that stands between our brains and the world. So in larger mammals, including human beings, the surface is made up of a whole bunch of folds. There are the gyri or ridges and the sulci or the valleys, and there's tens or dozens of them on the brain. Most researchers believe that the reason for this particular patterning on the brain is that it actually increases the surface area of the cerebral cortex, which then allows for greater neuron growth and development and also greater storage. Looking from the top down, on the left-hand side, you'll see that it's divided into 2 hemispheres. We're not exactly sure why that happened, but that is the nature of all brains. They tend to have 2 sides. It's possible because we have 2 hands and 2 legs and 2 eyes and so on, that's why we have a divided brain, but it's not 100% clear that that's why that evolved. At the cellular level, the most basic brain cells are called neurons. There are 100 billion of them when we're born. We have 100 billion neurons at birth. They don't really reproduce. They can regenerate, but they don't reproduce the way that other cells do, which is, I think, the source of the whole statement that brain cells, nerve tissue doesn't regenerate, is the notion that neurons themselves don't reproduce. You can see that the cell body has these long, spindly things growing out from it. Those are called dendrites. Those receive information, and at the end of the neuron there's also a synapse which transmits information. The whole purpose of the neurons is that they send electrochemical impulses from one neuron to another along a string that forms a network. And even though there are only a certain number of neurons that we're born with, the dendrites do in fact grow and change. They can build new connections with new neurons. It's a process that goes on for a long time. So the dendrites, which are, if you're looking at this particular slide, you'll see them attached to the cell body. They're the things that look like little trees. Those can and do reproduce, and they are the things that receive impulses from other neurons. So you can see that the way they grow off of the cell body, they can connect in all sorts of different directions to receive information from the neighboring cells. Those impulses move really fast. They travel down the axon, which is the main long part of the body here. They travel down the axon at up to 200 miles an hour, which is incredibly fast. The impulses sent to neurons in networks, they go through the synapses. So an impulse is received by a dendrite, it travels down the axon, and it's transmitted to the next neuron through one of the synapses at the bottom. And this is how they build all kinds of networks. One thing that's interesting to note about this is that these networks are constantly growing and changing. New networks are forming, old networks are going away. They're still there, but if they're not used on a regular basis, they kind of fade into the background. They decay a bit, and this process goes on throughout a person's lifetime. So looking from above, we see that the brain is divided into two hemispheres. As I said, we're not really sure why this developed. And there's another aspect to this that we're really not sure about either, and that is, for reasons that are unclear, the brain is cross-wired. So the left hemisphere of the brain controls the right half of the body, and the right hemisphere of the brain controls the left half of the body. We have no idea why that happened. The other thing that we do know is that the two halves are not exactly 100% equal. They're specialized in their functions. They do have parallel areas, which we'll get to in a second, within the cerebral cortex, but the functions that are actually assigned to each area are different, and that different skills, different perceptions, different processing is very localized, which is interesting because one of the advantages of having two hemispheres is that if damage occurs to a crucial area in one of the hemispheres, the other hemisphere can relearn that information. So can the surrounding tissue to a certain degree. So for example, in small children who have damage to their language center in the left hemisphere, they still may develop perfectly normal language because the right hemisphere area that is parallel to the area that was damaged on the left, that takes over and picks up the slack for what the left hemisphere is not able to do. It's really quite remarkable. It's easiest with children. Children have the most flexibility and adaptability, but we know that stroke patients can also relearn all kinds of skills. They can relearn to walk. They can relearn how to talk. They can really recapture almost all of the function that they had. This then is the cerebral cortex of the brain. Now we're going to start at the front and move back. So we're going to start with the frontal lobe, which is the red area of the brain. It's kind of the executive for the whole operation. It deals with all manners of organization and thinking. It sets goals and priorities. It's where we understand potential consequences. It allows us to weigh issues and make judgments. It allows us to form strategies and to plan ahead. It's also, interestingly enough, really kind of our highest human functions. It's our impulse control, our ability to control our own urges. It also is where we empathize with others. This is a frontal lobe operation. And it allows us to adjust our own behavior depending on a situation, so that we might choose to use one kind of approach in one situation and a different in another. That's a decision that is made within the frontal lobe. It also regulates our moods, which is a really important aspect because left to its own devices, the emotional centers of the brain can run they can create great havoc. But that is counterbalanced by the frontal lobe, which exerts a lot of regulations on how we deal with the world. This is also our source of insight, our cognitive flexibility, and our ability to solve problems. Next is the blue area. That's the parietal lobe. That is the center of touch, also of taste and temperature. The main area for processing touch occurs here, including both pain and temperature. It's the part of the brain that makes us aware of our bodies and how we are moving in space and how we are in space. It's responsible for coordinating movements. It's responsible for our spatial orientation and our spatial perceptions, and for some forms of calculations as well. Next back is the green occipital lobe. This is the center of visual processing. It's located at the back of the head, and it's used almost exclusively for that purpose, which tells you how important vision is to human beings, that an entire lobe of the brain is dedicated to it. Here there are specialized areas for face recognition, for the identification of objects, and it's here that beginning reading actually takes place. Whenever we're reading something, it actually starts within the occipital lobe with something as basic as letter recognition. Underneath the occipital lobe is the cerebellum. You'll see it's the kind of brown ridged area. The cerebellum is Latin for little brain, and among its other functions, it is the center of balance. It's deeply folded. It's also a two-hemisphere structure, just like the cerebral cortex itself. It represents about 11% of the brain's total weight, which is a pretty high amount, and it contains more neurons than all the rest of the brain combined, which I find fascinating because it tells you how difficult it is and how much brain power is dedicated to just coordinating our movements and timing complex motor tasks that we do, such as writing. Reading is also very much connected into the cerebellum because of this, and any kind of movement that we engage in. You think about walking down the street, that's your cerebellum in action. It also stores the memory for lots of automated tasks, things that we do so often, so repeated that we don't have to think about them. People who are very good touch typists, their ability to type that way is a factor of storage in the cerebellum. You tie your shoelaces. It takes a long time to learn how to do it. Once you do it, it becomes almost automatic. You don't even think about it when you do it. That is because that automated movement is stored within the cerebellum. Kind of tucked underneath the cerebellum and connected to the spine, in purple you see the brain stem. This is the main pathway for all of the information that comes into the brain from the rest of the body, and that goes out to the rest of the body from the brain. Of the cranial nerves, and there are 12 of them, 12 pairs of them, 10 of those pairs go directly into the brain stem. The most important, or one of the most important parts of it, is known as the medulla oblongata. It's one of the 3 sections of the brain stem, and it is responsible for the autonomic nervous system. That's everything that your body does that you don't control directly. Breathing, heartbeat, blood pressure, digestion, all of those things are actually controlled by the brain, but they are controlled by the medulla oblongata. It's like having a great autopilot in your own head. You don't have to think about how often your heart is beating. That's controlled by this part of the brain. Next to that, kind of coming around in yellow, is the temporal lobe. This happens to be my favorite part of the brain. It's responsible for auditory processing. It's where we hear and process all the sounds that we hear. The language center is found in the temporal lobe. In almost every human being, that's located in the left hemisphere. There are a few people who have it switched. It's located in the right, but for most of us it's in the left hemisphere. It's where we understand and appreciate music and analyze music, and that is in a parallel side. The language center is on one side, it's on the left side. On the exact opposite side of the brain in the same place, on the right side, is where music is appreciated and interpreted. It also interprets meanings of visual images. So you see something in the occipital lobe, but it's the temporal lobe that determines what it is and assigns meaning to it. It assigns and retrieves the names of objects, for example. The temporal lobe is also involved in long-term memory formation, especially when it comes to naming objects. Now, as I said, when you look down at the top, you see that there are 2 sides to the brain, and they are not exactly equal. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, they are cross-wired, so that the left hemisphere controls the right side of the body, and the right hemisphere controls the left side of the body. But that's not even close to all of what goes on with the fact that we have these 2 hemispheres. They really have different ways of perceiving the world and understanding the world. So we can think of the brain as being a parallel processor. The right side of the brain is interpreting it in one way, and the left side in a different way. So the left side tends to be everything that we focus on in education for the most part. It is logical. It is where the language center is. Mathematics, science, sequencing, systematic thinking, analysis. It is a rational entity. All rational thought occurs in the left side of the brain. The right hemisphere is completely different. It is analogical. It is not logical. It is where you have music and art instead of language and math. It is holistic in its approach to things. It doesn't analyze and break stuff down into chunks. It tends to see things in terms of their wholes. It is a pattern seeker. The right hemisphere looks for patterns far more than the left does, and based on those sometimes very incomplete patterns, it makes leaps of insight rather than drawing logical conclusions. Further on in the course, we're going to be spending a week looking at these 2 different ways of perceiving the world and how to harness those in terms of education. Between the two hemispheres is a wide, flat bundle of nerve fibers that connects the 2 areas. It's known as the corpus callosum. It's a bridge between the 2 areas, and it facilitates communication between the right and the left sides. The nerve fibers within the corpus callosum are longer than they are within the cerebral cortex itself. And the shorter nerve fibers in the cerebral cortex allow for much more rapid communication. So things move more slowly going from the right to the left and the left to the right than they do within the hemispheres. We're not quite sure why that is the case, but that is how the brain developed, so that communication within one side of the brain is actually enhanced as opposed to communication between the two hemispheres. We're going to be looking at the corpus callosum a little bit more also in that same week that we look at the left and right hemisphere. Now, underneath the cerebral cortex, we have an older region of the brain. It's sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain or the limbic system. The limbic system is the center of emotion. All emotional stuff happens from deep within the brain, which is older than all of the things on the outer side of the brain. So this is the part that is oldest in an evolutionary sense. All animals have this particular kind of system. Not all of them have the same kind of super developed cerebral cortices that you find with more sophisticated mammals, including human beings. We'll start with the amygdala, which, if you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see this little red area shaped a little bit like an almond. That is the amygdala. In fact, the word amygdala is Greek for almond, and this area of the brain was named for its shape. This is the center that integrates emotions and emotional behavior. Stimulation of the amygdala causes intense emotion. It's where that fight or flight response gets triggered. It can trigger aggression, it can trigger fear, and when experiences get connected to that kind of intense emotion, it can make the associations last absolutely for a lifetime. Which on the positive side is when the reward is especially sweet, the association is always going to be sweet. But by the same token, when faced with trauma or humiliation or punishment, those particular feelings are going to be connected to whatever was happening at the same time. And those associations will also last a lifetime. So in a classroom, that's really, really important to know. And we'll be talking about this in 2 weeks. But when a student is under stress or duress or is afraid, anything that is taught is going to get associated with those negative emotions. It's why creating a classroom environment is really, a good positive classroom environment is really critical. Also within the limbic system is the hippocampus. Hippocampus is Greek for seahorse, and as you can see, it looks very much like a seahorse. It also was named for its shape. The hippocampus is particularly associated with long-term memory storage and spatial navigation. And this is the area of the brain that connects emotions to specific content and learning, sensations, smell, sound, all of those things that get connected to memories. Again, so any positive associations become very much more positively associated. It strengthens them. But by the same token, negative associations are also strengthened by the hippocampus. It also acts as kind of the indexer of memory. So when a memory is formed, the hippocampus sends it for storage to the correct part of the cerebral hemisphere. So in addition to the lobes that we looked at, the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, and so on, there are also a couple of other cortices that are really important to understand. They are two bands that go from ear to ear. They stretch from ear to ear across the brain. And they are located right between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, kind of resting on top. The first one is the somatomotor cortex, or the motor cortex. That's the area of the brain that is responsible for movement. It controls all of the movements of the body, and it stretches through the different areas, kind of interesting ways. So, for example, you see that the motor cortex comes into the temporal lobe at a spot that controls the tongue, the lips, and the larynx. So that particular part of the motor cortex is what is connected to the temporal lobe, which makes a certain kind of sense, because the temporal lobe is where language is stored and processed, and of course produced. And we know that our speech organs include our tongue and our lips and our larynx. By the same token, next to the motor cortex is the sensory cortex. This particular band is responsible for information, for the sensory information, in particular, not hearing so much, although sometimes it is. That area down by the temporal lobe, again, is associated with hearing. But really the whole body's ability to feel things. So anytime you feel an itch on your knee, it's coming through that somatosensory cortex. It tells you how your body is feeling. If you look at the image on the right, the one part of sensory apparatus that we hadn't really talked about too much, it's actually, they're both related, smell and taste, are not located within their own lobes. So the visual center, which is back in the occipital lobe, has the whole lobe to itself, and the auditory center, which is in the temporal lobe, has most of that lobe to itself. But the sense of smell and the sense of taste are located deeper within the brain. They're actually in the limbic system themselves. You can see in the front part of the brain, in the image on the right, there's a secondary olfactory cortex. The primary one is that purple blob that's actually within the brain. And the sense of taste is right next to the sense of smell. It's interesting, this may explain a great deal about why smell and taste are such powerful triggers for emotions and memory. An example is there was an industrial cleaner that they used when my grandmother was in a nursing home for a short time. She was having some difficulties. There was this specific kind of cleaning solution that they used at the nursing home. And this was a rather depressing place to be. I remember going to visit her as a child and just being really, a sense of, awfulness about being at this place. And years later, I went to visit a friend in the hospital, and I walked in the door and was hit with the same smell. And it triggered such a powerful emotional reaction that I almost had to leave the hospital because it hit me so hard. That could be because the sense of smell is right there in the limbic system, so it doesn't have to travel far for the response to be a powerful one. So we come to a question of how do we know all of these things about the brain and how it works. And the initial studies, which really date back into the middle of the 1840s, the initial studies involved stroke patients and people who had suffered some kind of brain injuries. The physician would study the living patient, study their deficits, and then subsequently, when the patient would die, they would autopsy them and find the region of the brain that had been injured. One of the most famous of these is a guy named Paul Broca. Broca was a French physician, anatomist, and anthropologist, and he was trying to learn everything he could about how the brain processes language. So in 1861, Broca was called into a hospital to visit a patient named Le Borgne. Le Borgne's nickname was Tan, because that is the only thing he could say, the only sound he could pronounce. But he suffered no other type of loss in terms of language comprehension, and he had no other mental deficiency. It's just that he couldn't speak except to say that one syllable. So when Tan died, Broca autopsied his brain, and he discovered a lesion in the left temporal lobe near the area of the motor cortex that controls the lips, tongue, and larynx. And he hypothesized that that was the area responsible for producing speech. He confirmed that hypothesis over the next few years by studying 12 additional patients who also had damage in the same area and who also were aphasic as a result of it. Shortly after Broca published his findings, a German physician by the name of Karl Wernicke began his own studies on deficits in receptive language. What he found was that a little further back in the temporal lobe, at the upper end of the auditory cortex, if there was damage there, it resulted in a loss of comprehension and the ability to create meaningful sentences. And we now know of these two areas. We refer to them as Broca's area and Wernicke's area. The area responsible for physically producing words is Broca's area, and the region we know that is responsible for understanding language and creating meaningful sentences is known as Wernicke's area. Interestingly enough, we still study stroke patients today, and people who have had other brain injuries, because we still can learn a tremendous amount from them. A few years ago, I read an article about a stroke patient who had tiny little bit of damage in one little tiny spot on the brain, but he had lost his ability to name fruits and vegetables. And based on that, based on the damage that he had and the place where it was, the scientists hypothesized that that was the single area where those words and those concepts were stored. And subsequently, we have found that even though there are tiny little bits of variation, it may be, in a different place by a millimeter or a centimeter, it's still pretty much universally true that we store these concepts in the same basic places. So with the 20th century brought on a whole bunch of new technology and lots of advances in both invasive and non-invasive ways that we can understand the brain and how it works. The first was the electroencephalography, or EEG. In this, a bunch of sensors with a conductive gel are placed all over the patient's head. They're connected into wires that connect it to a board that go into a computer, and this machine can actually chart electrical activity within the brain. It can detect electrical impulses that are as quick as 1/1000th of a second, a millisecond. And this technology was first introduced in 1924 by a German psychiatrist named Hans Berger. It is non-invasive. the gel on the skin is kind of disgusting, but and it's also disgusting when it gets in your hair, but it is not an invasive procedure to have an EEG done. The only drawback is all it will do is show electrical activity. It doesn't really give you much of a picture of what's going on except for wavy lines. A more recent advance, which was developed in the 50s and 60s and kind of generally introduced in the 70s, is position emission tomography, which is also known as PET scans. These are really interesting because they are so bright and colorful. The way that they are produced is a little bit less exciting. A radioactive solution is injected into the patient. That solution circulates through the bloodstream, eventually gets to the brain, and what happens is that areas of the brain where there is greater activity, those tend to light up in bright yellows and oranges and reds. And where the brain is resting, you will see it as blues and greens. So the higher level of activity accumulates more radiation, and that's what causes the colors to display as yellows and reds and oranges. The drawback of this, and I must say, the PET scans are really quite gorgeous, and they can give us a huge amount of information about where things are being processed. So we can look at language, we can look at music, we look at language and music together. We can see what parts of the brain light up for each of those separate items. And you can see that within the frontal lobes, for example, there seems to be activity pretty much all the time. The drawback of this is that it uses radioactive material. And because of that, it can't really be used with healthy children because the risk is just way too high for them. So a newer technology is the fMRI scans. So you already know probably about MRIs, which use giant magnets to get a look inside of the body and to look at soft tissue in particular, as opposed to x-rays, which can show really only bone. The MRI can really show you soft tissue. The fMRI stands for functional MRIs, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. This was invented in the 1990s, and when an area of the brain is more active, just like it draws the radiation there, it also needs more oxygen and more nutrition, and that causes a greater amount of blood to flow into that area. Blood, with hemoglobin, which is the part of the blood that carries oxygen, the hemoglobin has a fair amount of iron in it, and because of that, it can be detected by the magnet. So when hemoglobin is rushing into an area, it shows up as a colored patch. It doesn't come up as color, it comes up as a white patch. But once the area is lighted up, scientists can then choose to color in that area to show how different things are being done. So it's color-coded for comparison. So this is a couple of, or it's a composite of a number of fMRI scans for good readers of 9 years of age and 9-year-olds who can't read. And the goal of this was to try to figure out why it is, where's the breakdown in all of this. And it turns out that the breakdown, as you can see, is in the green area on the far left. In a child that doesn't know how to read, that part of the visual cortex is devoted to facial recognition. But as they learn to read, a person who learns to read, that area that was part of the facial recognition area is reassigned to understanding letters and understanding how letters form into words. Objects, you can see, are pretty much the same in both, and geometric patterns are the same in both, but facial recognition is very different for people who can and people who can't read. Non-readers have much more of their brains assigned to facial recognition, and for readers, that part that is often, or that was originally assigned for facial recognition, is assigned for word recognition, reassigned. It's a really fascinating way of studying how people in different positions, different categories, perceive the world differently, and a little bit about, gives us a little bit of insight as to what's wrong, for example, when a child is having difficulty reading. Where is the problem taking place? The other thing that fMRIs can do is they can actually trace the movements of the electrical impulses within the brain in real time. And later in the course, I will show you a visual clip of how fast an impulse travels along a set of neurons within the brain, moving from one from one lobe to another. Okay. So next week we're going to be looking at the learning process a little bit more deeply. Now that you have some background in the brain and its layout and how it works, next week we're going to look at what happens to the brain during learning and what processes are involved and how that all takes place, and the sequence and the structure and the steps. And we're also going to look at how the brain changes and develops at different stages in a person's life. There are some really important developmental processes that are connected to the brain, and we're going to look at those also next week. Thanks, and I'll see you then.